Hey, I'm Jason Brigham, an associate editor for Liberal Currents. I'm happy today to be introducing a conversation between two very serious scholars, intellectual entrepreneurs, and economists, Branko Milanovic and Daniel Klein. Both professors have written extensively about the great Scottish philosopher Adam Smith, and today they are going to converse on the subject Adam Smith, left, right, other, or all of the above. And each will be speaking for 10 minutes, and then each will speak for 7 minutes, and then we'll have some general conversation to conclude. Uh, Professor Klein either won or lost the coin toss, but he was selected by a nickel to go first. And so, Professor Klein.
All right, great. Thanks very much, Jason, and thank you, Bronco, for doing this. I've got a PowerPoint. Let's see here. Look good, guys?
Yes,
Yeah.
yes, it does.
And this PowerPoint has more slides than I'm going to treat because it comes from a fuller presentation, but so I'm going to be quite brief. So there is a debate about, what to make of Smith and some of our modern conceptions of political outlook, ideology. And there's certainly been a big move to emphasize Smith as kind of a left-oriented thinker. And I want to push back on that. Sam Fleischaker represents this perhaps more eminently than any others. He's a super scholar and a very nice guy. I've enjoyed interacting with him on several occasions. And he's got statements like this one, which are quite strongly worded in that vein. Now, let's see here. Okay. I think that in general, the left Smithians are overplaying their hand, and I want to explain how I think so. Let me say that there were earlier intimations of left Smithianism going all the way back to these early 19th century guys like William Thompson, and then some through into the 20th century. Spencer Pack was significant in the sort of ramping up to the more modern and has been continued to be active. Emma Rothschild is eminent in this area, Samuel Fleischaker, and then numerous others. Some names I'll flash on the screen at least. Here are some quotes from Fleischaker, which I won't read, which again make pretty strong statements. And he actually espouses a sort of left Smithian outlook and talks about what it might mean today and talks about different kinds of reforms. Dennis Rasmussen had emphasized some of these things, claiming that Smith may have endorsed today redistribution, social welfare measures, living wages, and so on. He says he advocated compulsory and state-supported education. Ian McLean has a book that's very outspokenly left Smithian in these fashions, saying that Smith was an egalitarian and left-wing philosopher. Gordon Brown, in a discussion, suggested that rather than Smith today being associated with the right of center Adam Smith Institute, which I think is what Smith ought to be associated with, might more likely be at home with the left of center John Smith Institute. Eli Ginsberg, I think, is kind of significant going back a ways in some of this. I'm going to talk about that. Now, I don't want to go over this in detail, but what do I mean when I say the people are treating him as kind of a left-oriented person, and what do I think of left? I think that left political outlooks generally spell the governmentalization of social affairs, even if that's not exactly how it's expressed. I know that's not true on every single issue, but I do think it's the general tendency of what left has meant since left really became part of the political vocabulary, left and right, since about 1900, starting in France a little bit earlier than that. And so that's kind of what I mean. I know Smith was not a Murray Rothbard libertarian. I don't really think people have ever much claimed that he was, in sort of in the sense of being a very, very strict minimal statist kind of guy. In fact, Rothbard himself attacked Smith on those grounds as well as other grounds. I just want to highlight this nice piece by David Friedman, recent piece, where he goes over a number of the particular textual issues, and does, I think, a quite nice job. So that's something which I want to just point to. And he's one of numerous, or several, critics of the new left Smithianism. And these are some other names. And so I'm sort of with this group, you could say. Now, this is my main slide, and it covers 4 general criticisms. First, there's this inappropriate standard for saying that Smith was left. For example, that he sustained the supremacy of the good of the whole, or the holiness of the whole. I think that's true, but I think it's a non sequitur to say that that makes him left wing. And similarly, that he was egalitarian, at least in the sense of everyone counting equally and equality before the law, that individuals are not atoms, that markets depend on moral preconditions, that he did not advocate greed, that he was not a laissez-faire dogmatist, that he knew that a shilling meant more to a poor person than it does to a rich person, that he was not in his politics destinational and utopian, but rather directional and pragmatic. I think all that is true, but I don't think any of that is grounds for claiming him for the left. We can go into that, but that's my view. Second, the left Smithians just don't give due weight to the strong classical, what I call classical liberal spine of Smith's whole outlook and corpus. There's just so much in Smith which makes it clear that he is emphasizing that as central, and that his main lesson is to allow every man to pursue his own interest his own way upon the liberal plan of equality, liberty, and justice, as he put it. And I think it's clear that he's got this very, very skeptical view of government. Not only does he think that like free markets are bountiful and grow, and the division of labor extends itself, and people grow richer, sort of a rising tide raises all boats, general economic outlook. And not only does he criticize all of these things that hamstring that process, like on many occasions and sometimes quite emphatically, but also he's just got this very negative view of government and skeptical view of government and how well it can do things and how honest and functional it actually is. And the left Smithians just kind of they bring up a few pieces of text as though that kind of counterbalances this whole main spine of his whole work, including his whole analysis of commutative justice and the role that idea plays as a social grammar, not only in life among neighbors, but then also as a precept or a benchmark for political affairs. So that's just like this general problem that I see in left Smithianism. Now, sometimes they kind of acknowledge that Smith, favored liberalizing markets and so forth, but then they invoke a kind of, well, yeah, but that was then, this is now ism, as I call it, where they're saying, look, that was the order of the day in Smith's day, but Smith's broad ethical sensibilities are constant. And if we carry those through time in our day, it's a whole different ball game. And he would be in favor of, all the sorts of policies that left-oriented people today accept or endorse. And I just think that's false. I don't think, first of all, to first of all, claiming again that those broad ethical sensibilities make him left-wing, that goes back to this point up here. I don't think that does make him left-wing by itself. And then to say that the way those should cash out today is so different than how they cashed out in 1776, I just don't see the argument for that. I don't think that economic processes are so fundamentally different. I don't think that the problems of governmentalizing social affairs are fundamentally different at all. And so I just don't buy that argument at all, that the application is so different today. And then we come down to the kind of the scholarly matter of looking at particular passages and the particular passages that left Smithians bring forward as evidence for their claim on Smith. And there's a number of sets of texts there. Perhaps you could say maybe a dozen main passages, maybe half a dozen especially. And I just think there are often problems with the way they handle these passages. And I don't want to go into detail. I do have actually slides that would enable us to treat them if we want to get into some of them. But the main topics here that like I would be very prepared to push back on would be claims about progressive taxation, claims about Smith's favor for the government being heavily involved in schooling. I also think that the usury restriction endorsement in Smith is very curious, and I don't think it necessarily should be taken at face value. And other issues, also stuff about the regulation of labor markets, I think is significant in that connection. So those are kind of more specific things that we could get into, but I don't want to get into that. I just want to flash that Emma Rothschild talks about his support for progressive taxation, and she gets into some of that. There's other things on progressive taxation that have been highlighted that we could discuss. And my pushback on that. Then there's stuff about the regulation of labor markets that have been mentioned. And I think, again, Amartya Sen, I think, has problems there. The use of this equity besides passage, which is quite famous, is another interesting matter in all of this. Poor relief. Yes, poor relief is actually another one that I should add to the list as a significant one where I think they misplay their hand. And schooling. Yeah, and that's I think all I need to say. Am I about up to 10 minutes, Jason? Do you know?
I think that's probably good, Dan. I think that's
Okay, yeah. So I'll quit and turn it over to Branko.
Well, thank you very much. Thanks a lot to Jason for moderating us. Also, please let me know when I'm at 10 minutes. And thanks a lot to Dan for this presentation. We have agreed beforehand that the first presentations would be basically dealing with our points without answering the points which were raised. Obviously, that applies to me. I'm actually going simply to go through my own presentation, and then afterwards, both Dan and I would discuss each other's points. Let me explain why I believe that there is a misreading of Smith as being uniquely and specially anti-governmental thinker in the sense of skepticism towards government. The reason is as follows. When one reads Smith, it is very clear that he is very skeptical about all associations. So he looks at in each association from a very sort of skeptical and sometimes cynical angle. That applies to governments, applies to trade unions, or those didn't exist, but to organizations of labor, applies to the organizations of capitalists, whom he calls, at the time it was masters or employers, and applies even to the organized church. Now, when you look at these statements, which are, quite a few in the Wealth of Nations especially, but also in, I think, the Theory of Moral Sentiments, perhaps fewer, and also in the lectures on jurisprudence, you notice that the statements that are most numerous and most negative are actually regarding employers and employers associations. I can go and quote them, and actually in the papers that I did, many of them are well known, but they're seldom mentioned, because what happens is that people focus on his negative statements on government. So I would do the reverse. I would just focus on negative statements towards capitalists. Now, where do they come from? What kind of statements are those? The first group of statements, which is very interesting, is about the acquisition of wealth. That's something which is well, not specific to Smith, but really kind of goes, afterwards, is essentially repeated by Marx in the Primitive Accumulation. And these are statements about monopoly, monopsony, power, collusion, and plunder, colonialism, trading companies. We all know that he was extremely critical of the East India Company. He is extremely critical of crusades that made money for the cities of Pisa, Genoa, and Venice. The cities that are often held as a great example of trading cities and the early commercial society. He basically says they have become rich on suffering of others, and what he calls crusades, the greatest folly which ever befell the mankind. So this is the issue of the acquisition of wealth. But that goes further. The other reason why he is critical of capitalist associations, or what you can call the Davoses of the world, is because capitalists are few in numbers, they can easily talk to each other, and consequently, as he says, they are permanently in the business of deceiving the public. The government, as he says, Adam Smith says, cannot stop that collusion, but it should really do nothing to help it. So he's critical because they are also very influential, as he says. They're sort of very sophisticated, or they're in some sense full of sophistry in their arguments. The other groups, which are workers, are not, or landlords, are not as criticized by Smith for their influence of government policy, not because they are better people, but because he says landlords are indolent and lazy, and workers are uneducated. So the group that is most likely to influence government policy, and of course to help themselves, are capitalists, because they are more easier to combine, since they are fewer in numbers. They are more endowed with sophistry and ability to convince, and they would thereby have an influence of government policy which is out of proportion to their numbers. And the last point, the third point maybe, is out of proportion to the social interests. Now, why do I mention that? Actually, he says clearly in one, or at least one or maybe two quotes, he says that that's a group whose interest is directly opposite to the social interest. And the reason is that it is derived, I believe, from his theory of sort of evolution in income distribution. And I don't think it has been noticed before. The reason is as follows. When Smith is asked, actually, when he discusses what will be the evolution of income distribution in the future, he says, okay, as societies get prosperous, wages would go up. And of course, high wage is an indication of a prosperous society, and consequently low rate of interest is also an indication of a prosperous society. As we all know, the Netherlands is actually quoted precisely as a prosperous society. Now, the second source of income, which is rent, he says also will go up because there is greater demand for food, and there will be greater demand for all the produce of the earth, including mining. Now, which of the three incomes of the three factors of production would go down? Interest, because, as he says, in a richer society which has more stock, which means capital, there will be greater competition, and they would drive the rate of profit and hence the rate of interest down. Moreover, he says it is good that the rate of interest should be low because it does not allow people to live off interest alone. That's also sort of ethical, but it's an important statement. So to conclude, why he believes that the interest of capitalists run counter to society? Because he says their interest, the evolution of the income shares is detrimental to them, since the evolution is such that the wage share would go up, the land rent share would go up, and the rate of interest and the profit would go down. Their interest is not the development of society, because it really runs against their major source of income. And I think it's interesting to derive that statement, which, as I said, does exist when he says that the interests are opposite to the interests of society, from his longer-term view about what the good society is. And to conclude, that good society, I think, in terms of for Smith, is indeed a society of natural liberty, a free competition, but it is a society where the capitalist class does not have an influence on government policy, where rate of interest is low and the wage is high.
All right. Shall I proceed, Jason?
Sure. Yeah, let's go on to the next portion.
Okay, so the next portion is that now we each kind of react for 7 minutes. That was great, Branko. Thank you. Let me make clear to listeners that I don't see Branko as so much of a left Smithian, and I don't mean to impute, or to ascribe the criticisms that I made earlier to Branko. I reviewed Branko's writings on Smith in preparation for today, and I would, of the 4 points the 4 criticisms I make of left Smithianisms, I do not see Branko eliding the classical liberal natural liberty spine of Smith. I do not see him doing that. I do not see him taking passages and misrepresenting them or taking them out of context or that. The only thing I would fault him on, perhaps, is under that first broad heading that I listed of my 4 points, which is to suggest that Smith was sort of a left-oriented philosopher on certain grounds, which I don't really think make him such. And your remarks just now are kind of a little bit in that vein, in that, yeah, he's totally against, merchant groups, manufacturers, employers, rent-seeking and being granted privileges. They get those privileges from the government, and Smith's saying the government shouldn't grant all such privileges. And it's the government policy, the government action, which to me is at the heart of these ideological conversations and disagreements. So he's very suspicious of merchants in particular, and he does hardly say a nice word about them. And he does, just like you say, Branko, in that kind of interesting discussion he gives to the 3 classes, landowners, workers, and employers. He says the interest of the first 2 are quite aligned with the general interest of society, whereas the interest of the merchants, in the manner that you just described, at least those with influence and those who are in the position to get the privileges, those merchants, they are not aligned to the interest of society. They have an interest to narrow the market in whatever way they can, and that's generally through government privileges rather than the free market. So yeah, that's right. But I wouldn't chalk that one up for his left-wing bona fides. Actually, it's still totally consistent with Smith as classical liberal, pro-free market, and so on. Let me remark on a couple other things Branko just shared. It's certainly correct that Smith is critical of all sorts of organizations. And I do think he thinks that the further and more complicated social affairs get, the less reliable our moral signals become, and the more susceptible organizational actions become to corruption and vice. That's not to say that all organizations are equal. However, I do think he likes the idea of smaller, more local, and more voluntary-based organizations. So while it's true that he's skeptical of all organizations, I think he's especially skeptical of governmental organizations. And when it comes to employers colluding and so forth, I mean, again, and wanting to narrow the market, again, the danger is that they're going to avail themselves of government. And he says the government should not do anything to facilitate their doing so. So he never really comes out and says what we need are special legislations to protect workers, restrictions on employers to protect workers from this. What he says is that the government should not facilitate them or employers or do anything to make it possible for that collusion. There's one exception. There's one restriction that it seems having to do with payments in kind that might be an exception to what I just said. The nature of that very restriction is a little unclear to me. We could discuss it, so I'm not saying it's always 100% against some kind of protection, worker protection, but the general thrust is, I think, clearly to hold up the free market principle actually as the best protection against monopoly and worker exploitation. Yeah, I think those are the main things I have to say in reaction at this time, so I'll stop there.
Thank you very much, Dan. Well, I don't have a very strong reaction or critique. Let me try to explain how I see Smith, and you would see certainly parts where we totally agree, and I think maybe some parts where maybe the emphasis is different. I see Smith's view of first natural liberty and freedom to do whatever a person wants to do, trade, sell, buy, be entrepreneur, as absolutely in the background, absolutely fundamental. Then, of course, there are exceptions to that. For example, the Navigation Act is one exception that is dealt, differently in two parts of the book. So there are exceptions which may be due to the, national defense issues. And then there is like what I called in my book, I actually called it really existing capitalism, which would be the really existing capitalism where actually masters or employers have a disproportionate interest in government policy. What Dan said is interesting in the following sense. We can all agree that that was a critique of the, how should they say, really existing capitalism. Now, the question is really, is this critique directed mostly against collusions or lobbying by capitalists, or is it mostly directed to the government for not resisting that or being there so that you actually can influence that? So it's actually the question, should such a government exist on one hand, and that becomes really the critique of government, or it could be critique of sort of masters for having infused the government and to some extent become the government. So I agree that it could be actually seen differently. One part where I actually it's kind of interesting, but when Dan gave all these left-wing critiques, my critique is quite different, comes from a different angle, because I think that it is a mistake on the left wing to compare Smith in 1776 with today's situation entirely. I mean, there are significant differences. There is no doubt that the role of the state is much greater today, even if you were to take simply percentage of GDP that is actually spent. Smith could not have envisaged that actually 40 or 45% or even 50% would be spent. So then that becomes tricky, because obviously people from the right say, well, Smith probably would not expect more than 10% of GDP to be spent by the government. So the right critique says, look, guys, you're spending 50% and Smith would spend 10. So how can he be a left wing? economist. And I agree with that. But I think one has to put Smith in the framework of the time. And I think there are two important things that I think that make Smith much more progressive, or you want to call it, I called it also, pro-socialist or left-wing. Is the first one is the concern with the welfare of the largest group. And that largest group was actually wage workers. Workers in general, and that, of course, was not the case with mercantilist tradition before. So I think that is quite an important departure, which is towards the welfare of the largest group. And the second departure that he would consider things, actually Dan mentioned that, consider things like education and taxation. Actually, I think there was this sentence that you actually showed then about progressive taxation, which were also ahead of his time. And in that respect, I would see him as a left-wing economist. Not necessarily that when we compare what exists today and say, would Smith approve of all of that? Yes, I agree. Not only that, I'm not sure he would approve or not approve, but he could not conceive of it. So I think when we think of Smith, I think we should think of him in the conditions at that time. And as I said before, I think that the emphasis on the welfare of the largest group, concerned with poverty and including relative poverty, and concerned with the role of the state in education and taxation, make him different from the previous thinkers.
Well, let me react to that. That does have a bit of a flavor of a that was then, this is nowism. However, I actually kind of agree with what I take to be your part of your drift here in terms of the 10% versus the 50%. I think you're right that he's oriented around, the current status quo. So today, 2024, that's where we are. And I don't think he's going to say, oh, we got to cut out 40 percentage points right now, because I don't think he's that radical. But so I see it as like where you are in the moment in history, and then directional from there. And that's what I'm saying hasn't changed. The direction is still, let's not grow the state, let's not grow intervention, let's do the opposite if we can from here, and not necessarily radically. So I do think he would be, still come off as kind of moderate talking today, but I think the direction would be the same, and he would be wanting to reduce the 50% and all the regulation and so forth. Now, what you say about progressive taxation, that's one of the issues I feel pushback is needed on. First of all, he had 4 maxims of taxation that he thought should be sort of general principles for a good tax system. And the very first one was proportional taxation, which is to say a flat tax, as opposed to progressive taxation. And then there's this passage where he says it would not be very unreasonable if the rich paid more. But the whole context of that is that, hey, look, there's this certain kind of tax, people, a ground rent tax, a house tax, he calls it, kind of associated with Henry George, that has a lot of virtues to it because of the unique, especially because of the unique nature of land, in that it's in fixed supply, it's got no elasticity of supply. And he says these special features give this kind of tax certain advantages. However, well, the rich would be paying disproportionately because they own more of the land. Well, what should we think? Well, it is not very unreasonable that the rich should pay more than proportional. So it's not a feature of what he's talking about. It's a bug. And he's saying, look, it's a good idea even despite that bug. So it shouldn't be taken as a principle in favor of progressive taxation, that passage. And then there's also this thing about luxury carriages on toll roads. And he's saying, turnpike trusts can or perhaps should charge more. And that's you know, first of all, it's a toll on a road. I wouldn't necessarily call it a tax. And it's kind of like traveling first class. Like it's, in a way, first class costs so much more. It's kind of a way of price discriminating. And I just don't see it as that big a deal or really the same thing. The first maximum of taxation is proportional. So I think the case for progressive taxation is actually quite thin and has been very much overstated. His comments on education, I think, are complicated, on schooling. And his final words on the subject, in fact, are that maybe there's more advantage in leaving things entirely voluntary. He says this in the conclusion of the chapter in book 5. And so again, I don't think and if he looked today, if he were here today and looked at our government school system, I hardly think he would be favorably impressed. And I think he would probably be an advocate of school choice and school competition. For all the reasons which he favored competition and things like that, including churches. So I'd push back a little bit, I think, on some of your drift. There's one other point I meant to make, and I just wanted to say, he really, you know, hardly has a kind word for merchants and manufacturers. But, you know, he lived in an age of aristocracy, and he was trying to persuade the policymakers, the rulers, the aristocrats. And I think that's partly why he pinned so much on the merchants and manufacturers. He also wanted to make clear, like, I am not their apologist. I am not one, you know, like one of these guys. I'm not celebrating these guys. And meanwhile, you guys, your interest is in the same direction as the public interest. And you just need to pay better attention and understand it better. And let's reform things, you know, in this classical liberal direction. So I think that's, and, you know, he didn't want to condemn the government as being so foolish or so corrupt that it does these things knowingly and encourageably. So, you know, he's to some extent negotiating with the aristocrats and trying to persuade them to come along, which is one reason I think he reserved special abuse for the merchants and the manufacturers.
Let me take that last point that Dan made. Actually, you know, I agree with that, because I think I was saying before, we need to, I think, situate Adam Smith at that time and the place where he was writing. And actually, that's what you did now by saying that his critique, disproportionate critique of merchants, was a way of dissociating himself from them and not being seen as an apologist for their interest. This is a little bit like the what you call, how did you call it, Denism, with which I agree, you know. But I think that we actually, this is not a vice, in my opinion. It's actually a virtue to situate person and people generally in the place and time when they write. Now, let me say, I would skip, I think, education and taxation, because I think it can be interpreted both ways. I agree on taxation, which I know better, that there is this one sentence about greater than proportionally. But it could be, as you said, argued that it is, like in many things in Smith, that's actually derivative from a principles, that principles cannot be fully observed, so you do have to have an adjustment. But let me say what I think now, moving to the present, where the bulk or the strongest part of Smithian critique would be made today. I think that would be about lobbying, about special interests, and ability, well, the desire and ability of manufacturers, producers, companies to influence government policy. That, I think, would actually be, we are actually near Washington, we can see it every day. And I think it is there that the critique would be very strong, including the funding of the elections, the dependence of the electoral, of the body of people who are elected on support from the business sector. I think that's where the bulk, in my opinion, of critique that Smith or some Smith-alike would make today. And that's part of the critique that I have to say, when you read the Wall Street Journal, is not there. It is taken as a normal function of government to respond to what the, manufacturers or, employers want. And I think that that's where he would disagree with that.
That could be. It's hard to say how he'd react to the scene around us today. So I'm not sure where to begin really on that question. I think, yeah, there'd be so much for him to take in and consider. Anyhow, I don't know that we need to say more. I do want to just say that as a general remark, it's remarkable that we're talking about this guy who was born in 1723. And it's really remarkable and wonderful how people have different point of views and different, disciplines, as well as different religious faiths and religious orientations are still talking about Adam Smith. I think that's testimony to something special about him, that he appeals to so many people, and that we all want to claim him. I mean, it's like we're fighting over him. Not that you and I are so much, but this broader conversation.
I totally agree. I think that actually the wealth of his writing is such that obviously it appeals to people who are very different. Economists, sociologists, well, he was after all, into jurisprudence and moral philosophy. Appeals to political scientists, actually appeals, and I have used that quote and I will not go into that, but appeals even to people in international relations and those who actually talk about theory of war and the role of commerce in creating a more peaceful society. So I think he's, I think, so rich also because he's not dogmatic. And I think we would both agree that he's not dogmatic. He had a certain number of principles, but he was aware where he believed that these principles should be modified. It doesn't mean that he, I believe that they should be modified forever, but the modification should be a particular modification in a particular time. Well, later, maybe you would actually go back to the original principle. But I like this non-dogmatic attitude, which I think pervades the entire Smith, including, and maybe we'll finish with that, including the end of The Wealth of Nations, where he discusses U.S. independence. It's a very ambiguous discussion, which is quite long, where he actually lists the reason that he understands the colonists' desire to become free. On the other hand, he says, they have not contributed anything to the defense of Great Britain, whereas Great Britain has actually paid for them. So it's again a very, what should I say, from different angles. So it's not dogmatic. And of course, as we all know, he ends the Wealth of Nations with basically the statement about the U.S. independence, which also extremely with a great foresight. I mean, 1776, it was not obvious first that the U.S. would become independent. Secondly, that it would become a giant in terms of political and economic and military influence.
Yeah. I have a feeling that if we talked about him on imperialism and war and so on, well, there we probably wouldn't have any disagreements at all. Not that we're finding so many now, but
anyway,
yeah.
I think we can both agree that, I mean, obviously we are very much influenced by Smith, and I was, as the more I read Smith, somehow the more you learn, because you see the aspects that maybe at first reading eluded you.
Yeah, I find that too.
Well, cool, great conversation, Branko and Dan. Thank you so much for doing this today.